Good morning, I'm Jim Perkins, and I welcome you to the fifth presentation in the Spring 2013 OLLI program series, Foreign Cultures and American Foreign Policy. The objective of this program is to inform participants about foreign cultures and how they affect those countries' behavior, and how that knowledge can create an enlightened American foreign policy. Today's presentation by Professor James Sofka is The Jeffersonian Conception of Global Society, Political Culture, the Essential Ingredient for Foreign Policy. And a reminder that we will have our normal Q&A session at the conclusion of Professor Sofka's presentation, and we'll use again those microphones over there, and if you'll stand up close, that will help. And I want to acknowledge again the students who are here from Miller School. We appreciate your attendance. James R. Sofka is Associate Professor of International Relations at the American Military University and Adjunct Faculty at the Federal Executive Institute, where he teaches courses in international relations, European diplomatic history, and American foreign policy to senior members of the Federal Civil Service and Armed Forces. He previously taught in these fields in the Department of Politics in the University of Virginia from 1993 to 2006, where he also served as Dean of the Undergraduate Honors Program in the College of Arts and Sciences. He received his master's in 1991 and his PhD in politics in 1995 from the University of Virginia. A Jefferson scholar specializing in diplomatic history, Dr. Sofka has published widely on Jefferson's foreign policy and participated in international conferences organized by the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, where he has held 2 fellowships. I heard him speak at the 2010 Conference on Stability and Reconstruction, the Jeffersonian Diplomatic Tradition and Contemporary Society, which was put on by the ICJS at Monticello in conjunction with the American Academy of Diplomacy out of Washington, D.C. And that discussion was the source inspiration for creating with Professor Ramazani this OLLI program series that you've experienced last year and this year. Since 2000, Professor Sofka has annually presented on Jefferson's politics at the Brookings Institution, and he co-taught a seminar on Jefferson's foreign policy at Monticello in 2005. He has recently lectured on Jefferson for the U.S. Department of State, the Richardson Center, and the American Academy of Diplomacy. Along with other leading scholars, Dr. Sofka appeared in the 2010 documentary, Jefferson, which was broadcast nationally on the History Channel. And he recently co-edited a volume of articles by leading American and European scholars on America's role in the Mediterranean region during Jefferson's presidency, and is currently finishing a book-length study of Jefferson's foreign policy entitled A Commerce Which Must Be Protected, the International Policy of Thomas Jefferson, 1785 to 1809. Now his most recent book is Metternich, Jefferson and the Enlightenment, Statecraft and Political Theory in the Early 19th Century. And this was featured at a forum at Monticello just last October 2012. Now, Dr. Sofka has taken time out from what he calls his Jefferson Week. Yesterday he spoke at the Homestead. Today he is filling in and graciously taken his time in the middle of a very busy week to come and speak to us. Tomorrow he again lectures at the FEI. So please give a warm welcome to Professor James Sofka. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. Thank you, Jim, for that very generous introduction. It is always a pleasure to continue Jefferson Week as much as possible. As a Jefferson scholar, three presentations on Jefferson in a row is a labor of love and very enjoyable because there's so much to say and so little time to say it. It's my great pleasure to spend some time with you and talk in this series about Jefferson, political culture, and foreign policy. Jim had sent me, we talked at the time of the 2010 AAD conference, which was the genesis for this program. I've kept in touch with Jim about how he's put this together, and I realize that it's difficult to pinch hit in an otherwise stellar lineup. You'll have to indulge my sort of little Jefferson excursus here, but I'm going to try to link this back to the theme of culture that is the centerpiece of this class, and focused particularly on the question of Jefferson and revolution. Why someone who was known and built his career, starting at the age of 33, when he drafted the Declaration of Independence, as a spokesman for revolutionary change, and then opposed every single revolution that he encountered for the remainder of his life. And if you're wondering why that is, the shorthand answer, I'll walk you through some of the specifics and give you some case studies this morning, and hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A on not only Jefferson's diplomacy, but on all things Jeffersonian that may strike your fancy this morning, or at least that are within my wheelhouse to talk about with some level of competence. And the question is, why does Jefferson radically change course? Or does he change course in terms of his focus on revolutionary change? Now, Jefferson, it's interesting, for someone who started his first federal office as our first Secretary of State in 1790, when he was recalled as minister to France by George Washington to serve in that post, Jefferson launched into a tirade about how miserable American diplomacy was. He argued that, quote, "I consider diplomacy the pest of the world," unquote, and argued that, "I wish there was a meridian of partition across the ocean separating us from all of Europe so that we should stand on the same footing towards those nations precisely as does China," unquote. This, of course, when China meant a very different thing in international relations than it does today. Yet, after Jefferson let his blood pressure drop a little bit, and he sort of argued that, all right, maybe things aren't all that terrible, he argued, quote, "This is theory only, and a theory that the servants of America are not at liberty to follow," unquote. In other words, Jefferson himself rejects isolationism in all of its forms as a completely impractical policy for the United States to follow, and therefore sets the course of American internationalism from his earliest days as Secretary of State, and certainly in his presidency, in which he doubled the size of the Union through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The most important thing to think about as I walk through Jefferson's thinking on the role of culture, specifically the difference between the United States, the environment in which he matured, and the revolution that he helped lead, and what he saw going on elsewhere in South America and Europe particularly, is to sort of understand that the United States that Jefferson worked in is a very different one than we think of in 2013. And that is a United States that could be squashed like an insect, and almost was in 1814 and 1815, at any time by the great powers of Europe. Jefferson would be astonished if he could come back and realize something known as American superpower status today. It was a luxury he could not envision. The most that he hoped for was survival. If the United States could simply live and exist in international relations, that was a victory. And so if you start in looking from his world in Philadelphia or Washington starting in 1790, just sort of draw a mental map for yourself of the eastern seaboard of the United States. If you looked east across the Atlantic Ocean, the great powers of Europe could suffocate American trade at will. And the United States has to claw and fight tooth and nail from the European commercial powers for any diplomatic recognition or the ability to spread its goods overseas. If you look south on that map towards Florida and the Gulf Coast, what's today the Gulf Coast, you're facing Spanish and to some extent French and British usurpations on American sovereignty. Borders are still left very much up in the air. Even after Jefferson buys Louisiana in 1803, he doesn't even realize what he bought. He thought Pensacola and Mobile were included in the deal. Guess what? They weren't. And then he has to try to bribe the French in 1806 in order to get them to persuade the Spanish to sell them. In other words, the southern coast of the United States was largely under French and Spanish dominion. If you look north from Washington or Philadelphia, you have Canada and the Canadian provinces that stretched along the Great Lakes, where the British were still very much in charge, where there was ongoing debates about the return of forts and border installations and some leftover negotiations from the American Revolutionary War, and where the British, whenever they wanted to, could get Indian tribes to rise up against the United States and settlers and cause general trouble along that part of the continent. If you look west towards the Mississippi, once again, you've got France and Spain in control. Jefferson later argued that the Mississippi River was the single stranglehold for American commerce and survival. He calculated that nearly 50% of the total gross national product of the United States flowed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and whoever possessed New Orleans could effectively choke the United States from its western border. So in other words, if you're Thomas Jefferson, and you're sitting in the nation's capital, everywhere you look is misery. And therefore, Jefferson develops a conception of the growth of American power, the growth of the American diplomatic tradition, from a position of enormous insecurity and vulnerability. It's a key thing to keep in mind when understanding American foreign policy, because it's easy to look back with the luxury of post-Cold War America and think that our sovereignty and position in the world that emerged after 1945 came down as sort of divine right, that the United States, the post-Potsdam order was just sort of created, and the United States enjoyed this luxury of power in international relations. Or going even earlier, you could say, well, the United States was protected from Europe by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and therefore could emerge largely unscathed. But that wasn't until well after Jefferson dies in 1826. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was made possible not by American power, but by British power. It was the Royal Navy that at that time was guaranteeing the fact that the Southern Hemisphere would not be recolonized. So Jefferson is approaching every single case he encounters, particularly revolutionary upheaval, from that position of extreme weakness, which, to his credit, he acknowledges quite openly, not necessarily to foreign powers, that would be insane, but he does so certainly to his colleagues Madison and Monroe by arguing that he's still trying to ascertain what the correct position for the United States would be. And he's all over the map with this. Jefferson scholars such as myself could easily make a career of quoting Thomas Jefferson against Thomas Jefferson, and many of them do. And Jefferson, you could see, here's the man who was the first American president to lead regime change against a foreign government, and that was in Tripoli in 1804, 1805, which is, of course, the antecedent to the Marine hymn, To the Shores of Tripoli. And Jefferson would then later agree with Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in 1821 that, quote, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, unquote, and focused solely on the preservation of American independence. Now, you could look at this and say, wait a minute, here you have a Jefferson robustly using military force in the Mediterranean to overthrow foreign governments, and yet a few years later he's agreeing with Adams and saying we should only be focusing on cultivating our own garden and should not be focused on attempting to change the world in the American image. What's up with this? Well, of course, if time permitted, we could walk through the long diplomatic narrative history and focus on all of these things and the changes that occur. As with all historical scholarship, it's important to realize that Jefferson, just like President Obama or President Bush, is a man of his political context and times, and citing Jefferson's quotes from a particular year does not necessarily mean that Jefferson believed those things a few years before or a few years after. Like any sophisticated politician, he's reacting to what's on the table in front of him. And so therefore, it's extremely important to look at Jefferson in a case-by-case analysis and to focus on this idea of political culture. And Jefferson is extremely sophisticated with this. This is the man, after all, who's no wild-eyed revolutionary, who comes to the American revolutionary cause from Virginia like a lot of Virginia landowners did, mostly very angry that the British have closed off land claims west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is certainly one of the reasons why Washington joins the revolutionary cause, because all of those claims are suddenly invalidated by British decree in 1763. And Jefferson becomes, by the time he leaves France, he is so supple in the ways of European diplomacy that during the time of the Louisiana Purchase, he manages to impress Napoleon and his foreign minister Talleyrand with what a hardball realpolitiker he was. And believe me, that took some doing in 1803. As a matter of fact, Napoleon actually accused Jefferson of being at times duplicitous in international relations. This is the man whose famous diplomatic maxim was always what he used to tell his foreign minister whenever he negotiated a treaty, that if there was no obscurity in the document, always add one or two in, because it may be useful for future occurrences. And Jefferson certainly followed that maxim. So why does Jefferson, sort of in terms of political culture, why is that an important point in trying to understand this man's diplomacy? Well, Jefferson is a disciple, as many of his contemporaries are, of the French theorist Baron Montesquieu, who you may have encountered in some of your previous readings. Montesquieu's book, The Spirit of the Laws, was written in 1748 and is really the Bible of studies of political culture and sociology. Montesquieu famously argued that laws and political contexts have to be understood organically. They have to be understood in the society in which they developed, and he had a famous quote by saying, "What may be good in Paris will not work in St. Petersburg." And so Montesquieu stresses in the 18th century the importance of knowing language, of knowing culture, of knowing legal and social history, and religious traditions even, to understanding how a nation develops an identity, and from that identity, you can begin to understand how it's going to operate with other nations in the international context. Jefferson loves Montesquieu, reads him not only in English translation, but in the original French, and Jefferson considers himself a devout disciple of Montesquieu's focus on political culture. And this is the reason why he sees no contradiction between being the penman of the American Revolution in 1776 and yet scathingly critical, and I'll give you just how critical, towards revolutionary movements in Latin America in 1818 that cited Jefferson's own words in the Declaration of Independence in their struggle against Spain for independence. And the focus here, there are other issues, but I think culture, particularly Montesquieu's idea of a slow growth of institutions over time, an idea that the British theorist Edmund Burke would pick up a few years later, is instrumental in understanding how Jefferson approaches this topic. Now, Jefferson truly believes that there are some rights that all human beings everywhere in the world should share, ideally, regardless of society, regardless of government. Specifically, freedom of political expression, freedom to worship it or not as one chooses, and the idea that governments should generally reflect the will of the majority of their inhabitants. Jefferson believes in these ideas throughout his life and does all he can to promote them. But he's the first to acknowledge that the actual expression of those rights, how they will occur, to what degree, in what dimension, are going to be shaped by the reality of individual governments and individual societies, and one cannot expect rapid change overnight. And so Jefferson, while he has this broad philosophy, Jefferson is not one to overly theorize. Some of you may know this, but Jefferson never wrote a systematic book of political theory. Jefferson, after the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom is passed in 1786, he generally backs away from very controversial political arguments, particularly in regards to slavery, which is, of course, a whole other topic. And Jefferson is not one to try to legislate, particularly in foreign policy, where the stakes for survival are just so high, from what we would call an ideological or theoretical compass. Jefferson is not someone who is going to sit up till 2 o'clock in the morning arguing the virtue of truth to you. He's a man who famously said, quote, "When I encounter a proposition beyond my finite comprehension, I abandon it as a weight which human strength cannot lift. And I truly believe that in these cases, ignorance is the softest pillow on which I can lay my head," unquote. And who later acknowledged to John Adams that after he finally reread Plato's Republic, which of course is probably the greatest expression of trying to legislate a political culture around the idea of a philosophical notion of justice, Jefferson argues that, quote, "I'm astonished the world has given reputation to this nonsense for the past 2,000 years, unquote. So Jefferson is not somebody who in the realm of international relations, he may sit and like to debate privately over sherry at Monticello some of these ideas, but when it comes to actually being responsible for American national security, he does not believe he's got the luxury of pulling out Plato and attempting to legislate from an ideal state. So these inalienable rights that he puts forward in the Declaration of Independence are ones that he later argues are expressions of the American mind in 1776. One of the most important letters Jefferson writes, at least in my opinion, and he writes 24,000 of them in his lifetime, is one of his last. And it's where I want to sort of break down some of these case-by-case analyses and then open it up to some questions and conversation. When Jefferson is... In 1825, when Jefferson is 82, he's asked to come to Philadelphia to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. The chairman of the organizing celebratory committee is Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, later known as, of course, the father of Robert E. Lee. And Lee writes to Jefferson and said, "We would love for you to come. You wrote the thing, after all. You're the only surviving draftsman. Come and discuss this with us, besides Adams." And Jefferson writes him back and says, "No, I'm too old, I'm too weak, I can't make the trip." And then he goes a little bit further. And he argues, just to paraphrase, that there should be some caution in celebrating the Declaration. This is not something that authors, especially famous ones, normally do about their words. Because by 1825, Jefferson has heard the American Declaration cited in Haiti, in France, in what will today become Bolivia and Venezuela by Simon Bolivar. And Jefferson is extremely nervous that the Declaration has gotten too big, that it has grown beyond the context of July of 1776. And he argues that, quote, "This document should be understood as an expression of the American mind at the time," unquote. In other words, Jefferson, the practical politician, was given a job to do in 1776. And that was to justify the American separation from Great Britain, which had already achieved some degree of popularity in the American colonies. He dusts off his John Locke, who famously argued that there were 3 cardinal rights that all humans enjoyed, which were, of course, life, liberty, and property. Jefferson has to strike the last one because of the nasty slavery dispute that was going on at the Continental Congress, and put in the pursuit of happiness, because who the hell can argue with that? And Jefferson, it was politically neutral. And Jefferson sees this as a political tool. And he believes that the Declaration accurately reflected the majority of votes in the Continental Congress in the summer of 1776, and would express candidly, as he put it, to a candid world, those ideas abroad. And in that, he believes he was successful and sealed his fame. However, he did not write the Declaration of Independence as a manifesto for global revolution. Jefferson does not see himself as the early 19th century Lenin in attempting to put forward an ideology that would apply in all places and in all circumstances. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let me walk you through some specific cases to show how Jefferson actually becomes nervous about his own words and why he has this tension. And let's take them case by case in the historical order in which they occurred. First, in Paris. Jefferson goes to France in 1784, and by 1786, he's having conversations with the liberal aristocrats of the First Estate that would start what becomes known as the French Revolution. And Jefferson is immediately put off by their complete lack of political sophistication. Why these men had read Montesquieu and Diderot and Voltaire, and they had wonderful dinner parties and drank a lot of Bordeaux. They had never administered any single entity, even at the most local level, in their lives. Now think about this. In America, the leaders of the American Revolution, men such as Jefferson and Patrick Henry and Adams, had served in colonial legislatures. They had been running and chairmen of committees. They had administered money. They had been on organizing committees. Many of them actually operated, like Franklin, their own newspapers and press organs. These were responsible businessmen and politicians who not only had a great deal of wealth, but they had an enormous experience in actually administering political life. And from that, they were extremely successful in organizing the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, and the Continental Congress itself as a means of furthering this, which they all borrowed from the colonial experience. Jefferson and Patrick Henry got their earliest political training by sitting in the back rows of the House of Burgesses. Jefferson, when he was a student at William and Mary, would simply just sit there with a pad on his knee and listen to political debate. And by doing so, he not only got an education about what was going on in Virginia and in the British Empire, he also learned how to argue, he learned how to frame a debate publicly in front of his peers, and he considered this a great deal of political training and acknowledged that without that, he would have been completely mystified during the Continental Congress of how to try to get through the process and finance and fund the American Revolution. But in France, there was none of that. Everything was run by the king. It's an autocratic monarchical system. There are absolutely no local administrative entities equivalent to the 13 colonial legislatures in France. Canada, as a matter of fact, the entire province was run as an adjunct of the French Navy. It was actually governed by an admiral and was considered a landlocked ship in official French documents, and it was governed accordingly. So you didn't have that in that system. Everything was top down. The Catholic Church is enormously powerful in France, which Jefferson realizes, and the Catholic Church at this time is not a very democratic institution, and where priests and bishops control political life, unlike in New England, where you had Protestant churches that had vestries that also dealt not only with clerical matters, but oftentimes actually were local assemblies and at times courts of law that were under a religious guise but took on other powers. So again, political culture. More representative, more democratic, and above all, based on experience. And it's Jefferson who later argues that, quote, 40 years of actual experience in a government is worth more than a century of book learning, unquote. So Jefferson goes back to this idea of culture and experience. So he's in France. These guys come to him and say, Jefferson, you led a revolution in America, teach us how to lead one against the king. And Jefferson is terrified. First of all, as an American minister, he does not want to get involved in the sovereign affairs of another state, and he backs away from any direct advice, realizing that that would be toxic to American security because it could potentially embroil for America in a war. He's open to dealing with these guys, not necessarily only because he shares some of their ideas, but he believes that if they take power in Paris, they might cut America much more liberal trade deals in the French West Indies, which were enormously lucrative at that time, than the King of France, Louis XVI, would. But Jefferson's nervous, and he writes to Madison a very interesting letter. This is in June of 1789, before the storming of the Bastille, in which he argues, quote, I think that their project, that is the revolution, will fail if attempted, as they know man only as he is in a book and not in the world, unquote. In other words, these leaders, while very smart, while very sophisticated, did not have the practical day-to-day experience in actually administering a government that you had in America. And Jefferson argues later that, quote, all of the subsequent sufferings of the French nation flowed from the fatal error of the Republicans, unquote, in wanting too much too fast. So in France, while Jefferson is frequently considered a Francophile, and he certainly was in his taste for wine and architecture, some of which he brought back to UVA, Jefferson is very nervous that if you attempt too much liberty in a culture that had never experienced it, what you're going to wind up with is despotism. And this is, of course, what happens in Napoleon's seizure of power in 1799. That if you simply attempt to export the American model abroad, it is going to end in disaster. And what's interesting is that was not only a comment that Jefferson's writing in 1815, although he does, that's an argument Jefferson sees coming as early as 1788, 1789. That this project is simply not grounded in French society. And actually in France, if you look at Jefferson on the political spectrum in 89 and 90 before he comes home to America to become Secretary of State, Jefferson is actually on the right of the political spectrum in Paris. He argues to the Republicans, those who are leading the revolution, that, you know, it might be better for you to emulate Britain. Keep the king. Keep a lot of the institutions. Don't antagonize the Catholic Church too much. Try to get some freedom of the press. Try to get a little bit of representation. And maybe in another 10, 20, 30 years, you can push for a little bit more. So Jefferson is, at his most robust, an incrementalist, exceedingly cautious in his approach to the French Revolution. And he has to deal with the effects of it throughout his tenure as Secretary of State, as in 1783 it almost draws France into a war, and the United States becoming a party in a war between France and Great Britain. So in France, he is no rabid revolutionary at all. Let's fast forward a few years to two other cases, and then I'll sort of summarize all these points. In Haiti, Jefferson is President of the United States in 1801. He has had to deal with this upheaval in France that occupied most of his time in the early 1790s, and which is still occupying the United States under Napoleon's dictatorship, and a war that breaks out, a general war in Europe that will eventually help him get the Louisiana Purchase. But there's a revolution in Haiti that's going on at the time, then called Santo Domingo. And black slaves have broken off and achieved some independence from their French masters. They have seized arms, and they are leading a massive slave uprising against whites in Haiti, which is a bloody, vicious battle. Napoleon indicates that he's going to send a 40,000-man army to Haiti in order to suppress the slave uprising, and then send the remaining force to New Orleans. And when they land at New Orleans, they're going to garrison it and potentially close the Mississippi River to American trade. Now, remember what I said, the Mississippi's the stranglehold. To make things worse, these Toussaint Louverture, the main leader of these former slaves, uses Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence to declare Haiti, 1, a sovereign nation, 2, borrowing directly from the line of inalienable rights of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's own text, and 3, calls on the United States to assist his new nation in its struggle against France, arguing that it was the same as America's struggle against Great Britain. What does Jefferson do? Well, he's got a problem. Because as a slave owner, the last thing he wants to do is sanction a revolution led by freed blacks that have in many cases murdered their white overseers. Jefferson, however, favors a very cautious approach. At first, he sends some letters arguing, yes, I'm generally sympathetic with your arguments. I think I could help you out. And he covertly sends American arms and military assistance to the freed blacks in order to bleed Napoleon's army, which he does. So Jefferson is actually attempting to change the balance of power. And however, while he says nice things to Toussaint, saying, you know, after the thing is concluded, why don't you come to Washington and maybe we'll work out a diplomatic recognition pact in order to keep him along. The main thing that Jefferson wants to do in Haiti is bleed that occupation army. So there will be fewer, the more that the Haitian blacks kill, the fewer will land in New Orleans and cause trouble for the United States. And Jefferson is already sending Lewis and Clark, what becomes the Lewis and Clark expedition, out to the west, not to reconnoiter Indian artifacts, that comes later, but as a military reconnaissance in case the United States actually has to go to war against Napoleon at this time. And so once this happens, once the Louisiana Purchase is concluded, and he's also using this to ratchet up some pressure, Jefferson has to now deal with the independent Haitian state. Napoleon's armies are defeated. Malaria and yellow fever kill more French troops than do Jefferson's arms. However, when Toussaint writes to Jefferson and says, okay, the French are gone, we're now independent, we're now leading a state, we are the first republic besides you, the second, in the Western Hemisphere, and one led by a majority black government, we'd like your recognition. Jefferson cuts off all communication immediately, refuses to receive a Haitian delegation, and never speaks publicly about Haiti for the remaining years of his presidency, and never touches it again for the rest of his life. Now, Jefferson comments about this privately by arguing essentially that this was a purely tactical move, that there was no way that he could acknowledge an independent Haiti led by blacks. This was something that would never pass muster in the American South. Not only that, Jefferson argues to Madison that he realizes that this government will probably not be viable and will end in despotism, simply because, again, there's no practical institutions of self-governance that exist in Haitian society, and therefore what you're going to wind up with, inevitably, he argues, is strongman rule. Now, Jefferson has been blamed numerous times for letting the Haitians go. Haiti's a curious case in my sort of discussion of political culture, because there is an argument that's been put forward by a number of scholars who have looked at this by arguing, had the United States been more supportive of the independent Haitian government, potentially they could have changed some of these realities later in the 19th century. It's a debatable point. But what we know is that while Jefferson at first accepts these overtures from Haiti, citing the American Declaration of Independence, once he gets what he wants, that is Napoleon out of the Western Hemisphere after the purchase, he simply walks away from it and won't touch it, and refuses to even receive that delegation. Let's talk about the last one, and then a counterpoint, and then sum up. And that is Latin America. When Jefferson retires in 1809, returns to Monticello, he says that he never wants to deal with statecraft, revolution, or any of these complex diplomatic activities at all for the remainder of his life. That's a fantasy. Jefferson gets completely miserable and gets migraines whenever he doesn't have a period where he's not receiving news and information about what's going on in world politics. And in the 18-teens, 1817, 1818, he has an elaborate series of correspondence with James Monroe, who of course becomes president, as well as John Adams in retirement in Massachusetts, about this major problem facing the United States, which is independence movements that are blossoming in what is today South America. And Jefferson, most of them led by not only Francisco Miranda, but Simón Bolívar in Venezuela, who of course Hugo Chavez saw as his model of Bolivarian socialism. And Bolívar is using takes Jefferson's declaration, translates it into Spanish, changes the proper nouns from England to Spain and Madrid from London, and uses it as the template for his revolution against Spain. Jefferson is horrified and writes a series of letters back and forth to Adams, arguing the United States should, number one, have nothing to do with this revolutionary movement, and number two, arguing that it will fail utterly miserably. He writes to Adams that, quote, "This will end in tyrannies more or less numerous in our southern hemisphere," unquote. And Adams writes to Jefferson that, quote, "I believe that the idea that they will form democracies along the lines of our model are as visionary as a ride to the moon in a cart drawn by geese," unquote. Jefferson enthusiastically agrees with that assessment. So once again, Jefferson is not only arguing a non-interventionist policy, that's consistent, although he does intervene briefly in Haiti when it suits him, but he's also arguing that he does not believe this project of democratization is going to work. Why? Jefferson cites several reasons why democracy will not take hold in South America. One, as he argues, the power of the Roman Catholic religion, unquote, just like in France. Second, the role of military in those societies and polities, unquote. And three, to paraphrase, the lack of self-governing institutions and a political culture that had been based on a bottom-up aggregation of social interests. In other words, what he sees going on in the former Spanish colonies is identical to what he saw going on in France 40 years earlier. And that is a revolution that is led from above by a small enlightened cadre that does not have full-bore experience in managing the state in terms of all of its administrative tasks, and where the political culture had been based on a monarchical and autocratic principle rather than the self-governance that had existed in Britain's 13 colonies. Yes, of course, Britain was a monarchy. Yes, Jefferson directed his venom against King George III, but even American revolutionaries acknowledged that the king was largely a figurehead, and their issue was largely with the administrative apparatus of the British state with which they interacted every day countlessly on any one of a number of issues. So in all three of these cases, just to summarize, France, Haiti, New Spain, Jefferson is using the idea of radically different societies and radically different political cultures to argue that what worked in America cannot be translated or exported to other parts of the globe. And in that, he's consistent. However, one counterpoint case, and then to summarize about this a little bit, and that is the Barbary War, which is where I've actually spent most of my academic research. Jefferson does lead an intervention against a foreign government, as I alluded to, against the Pasha of Tripoli in 1804 and 1805. That's about as close of an intervention as you can possibly get. But when Jefferson does this and attempts to impose a new government in Tripoli, he is not forming one along the American model. This is not Iraq in 2003. He's not creating a government that's going to be sort of brought in from Washington to administer that society in a very different way. No, Jefferson turns to an ally, a local ally, in this case, the Pasha's own brother, who had a claim to the throne. Jefferson finds out about this, and with the backing of the State Department and the American Navy, attempts to remove one sitting head of state and interpose another of the same culture, with the same norms, with no attempt to change the society at all. The only reason he does it is because he believes the new guy is going to owe him a favor and will form more liberal trade deals and will release American captives that were still being held in a fortress in downtown Tripoli. In other words, Jefferson's intervention, to use quotes, was not intended, his regime change, was not intended to bring new norms, certainly not democratic norms, into the Middle East. What he was attempting to do was play the age-old diplomatic axiom of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. However, and this is an interesting story, Jefferson does show himself to be very aware of the importance of culture in dealing with subsequent events in that region. Jefferson is extremely impressed, pats himself on the back and crows about it all over Washington, that his war had been so successful, even though the overthrow in the government of Tripoli was not, because the existing pasha cut a deal before the new guy could be installed, which Jefferson was happy with all the same. And the other guy was cut loose to his own fate, which was most unpleasant, and he excoriated Jefferson for the rest of his life by saying he had been abandoned by the Americans, which was true, but which Jefferson didn't lose a lot of sleep over for the remainder of his life. Nevertheless, the government of Tunis, a neighboring state, sends a diplomatic mission to the United States in 1806. This was before Russia or the Austrian Empire had diplomatic representation in Washington. This was an enormous coup to have a minister from the Mediterranean world in downtown Washington walking in full Arab headdress in 1806 in an era where no one had seen this before in the United States. Jefferson also, in order to smooth relations, gave money out of his personal accounts to the creation of a mosque in Washington, along with a Jewish synagogue and a Roman Catholic church, in order to spread religious pluralism. However, negotiations with the minister do not go well, and Madison reports to Jefferson that one of the main reasons why the minister was unhappy is he was in a bad mood because he was away from his harem. And he tells Jefferson and explains this custom. And Jefferson and Madison come up with, and I could not make this up, they come up with an ingenious strategy using what they see as this culture from that part of the world to make him happy. They hire on the State Department payroll a Greek cook who's actually a prostitute and charge all of her expenses to the State Department so that she may cater to the minister's needs. And Madison actually has in the State Department archives, there is a writing in Madison's own handwriting as, quote, an appropriation for foreign intercourse, unquote. He tells Jefferson exactly what he's doing, and 2 months later reports how elated he was that the minister's spirits had improved and that a trade deal was rapidly agreed upon. Now, this is sort of a humorous aside, but Jefferson showed himself willing to use all kinds of political tactics in order to achieve his ends. But above all, what Jefferson is focused on, humor aside, is the national security interests of the United States. And what Jefferson believes, while he has to deal with the reality of revolution, he has to deal with the reality of foreign cultures citing his words in some cases directly against him, he has to deal with what he's accused of hypocrisy, of changing his mind on international relations all the time. Jefferson argues that national security considerations are uppermost. And even in some cases, such as in France, and maybe in a few of his moments at Monticello on particularly sunny days when he was contemplating his hyacinths and tulips, he may have even had some sympathy for Bolivar, although probably not too much. But Jefferson believed that was a luxury he could not afford. The United States could not afford to be drawn into all of these contests, most of which he believed were lost causes. And they're lost causes because there's no awareness of the fundamental cultural realities that were underpinning those causes. Jefferson himself sees it firsthand in Paris when he's there, and he relies upon informants to tell him a great deal about what's going on in Spanish America in 1817 and 1818 to fill in the gaps. But Jefferson sees this idea of national interest as paramount. Let me just sort of sum this up with a couple of quotes, and then we can open it up to a conversation. Jefferson engages later in his life with a series of letters with foreign and domestic correspondents who love to try to call him out on gotcha letters for hypocrisy. Jefferson has to deal with this. Of course, slavery is one, and that comes a little bit later. Jefferson has to deal with several that I'll share with you that'll hopefully open up some questions and conversations. One of which is with his old friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, who visits Monticello in 1824, of course, for a triumphal visit. But Lafayette and Jefferson engage in a correspondence, a very lengthy correspondence, in 1814 and 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, right before Napoleon returns back from Elba, on what went wrong in France. And Lafayette acknowledges to Jefferson that he, Jefferson, was right and Lafayette was wrong in the 1780s. Lafayette, of course, had been one of the champions of the revolutionary process and then had to flee France when he was targeted by the Jacobins, because many of these guys who led the French Revolution were, of course, killed later by Robespierre and others. And Lafayette writes to Jefferson and says, "You saw this coming, why? What gave you this insight?" And Jefferson writes this gem to him in 1815. Quote, "Possibly you remember how earnestly I urged you and the patriots of my acquaintance at the time," this was when he was minister, "to enter into a compact with the king, securing freedom of religion, freedom of the press, trial by jury, habeas corpus, and a national legislature, all of which it was known he would then yield, and then go home, and let those work on the amelioration of the people until they shall have rendered them capable of more," unquote. Go home. It's the ET doctrine of American foreign policy. Jefferson is essentially focused here on a very passive approach to social change. If you listen to that letter, not only is there no call for what we saw happening in France, certainly the bloodshed in 1793 and the terror, but Jefferson's main demands, habeas corpus, trial by jury, national legislature, were pretty familiar. Basically, what he was saying to Lafayette was, you guys should have done what the British did for us. That is, establish a series of institution and cultural norms that allowed our colonies to prosper for 100 years and develop, largely under salutary neglect, their own institutions, and then, down the road, you press for more. And that's a very insightful commentary from an aging Jefferson, looking back and discussing why, to answer Lafayette's question, he was able to see some things that the French could not. And to elaborate this a little bit further, in other correspondence with French discussants, Jefferson argues that in subtle ways, they relied far too much on theory. They relied too much on attempting to take a series of abstract norms and translate them into political reality rather than working with what existed at the time. And by the way, in terms of political culture, that is an argument that was becoming extremely popular at the time and even today in academic discourse. Edmund Burke, around 1800, was writing that the reason the American Revolution succeeded and the French Revolution did not and ended with Napoleon was that Montesquieu was right and that political culture mattered. Because think about it. In America, the same generation, the same cast of characters, Jefferson himself, hold power for 50 years. James Monroe is president of the United States in the early 1820s. He had been a captain in the Continental Army in the late 1770s. Whereas in France, by the time the revolution ends, there's virtually no one left who had actually been at the early stages of that process in the 1780s, other than people like Talleyrand and Lafayette who actually had to leave the country while that revolution was going on. So this idea of the maintenance of control by a group of elites who were able to manage that change because that change was part of them and part of their society was what made America special. Jefferson is aware enough to know that. He sees it. He knows that this is something unique in this hemisphere. And because of it, he doesn't believe it's going to work if you export it. Hence his support of Quincy Adams' argument that the United States should basically cultivate its own garden, build its own freedom and institutions, and wish others well around the globe, but not get too close to their struggles. Because almost certainly that's going to get us into places that we don't want to be. And so culture, what you're talking about, is the essential ingredient of not only an awareness of political society by Thomas Jefferson, but it's his roadmap. It's what he relies upon in guiding him through this period of revolutionary change and through a set of upheavals. But just to close and open this up for debate, that is not the only contradiction that Jefferson has to deal with. Jefferson is also, more broadly, accused later in his life of violating all of his own stated principles while he was charged with managing the foreign policy of the United States. In other words, not only were his specific policies challenged for violating what he had written in the Declaration of Independence, if you're thinking theoretically, but that Jefferson's own personal conduct, the way he did business as President of the United States, bore no resemblance to the Thomas Jefferson who was facing off against Alexander Hamilton in the early 1790s. Many of you know that Jefferson had built his entire political career on the idea of strict construction. The president cannot claim an iota of power that was not listed in Article 2 of the Constitution. If it's not there, you can't do it. That's what he used against Hamilton when Hamilton wanted to charter the Bank of the United States in 1791, and Jefferson accuses him of trying to lead the United States into Caesarism because he was slowly, accreting this power that was not listed in the Constitution. Well, guess what? Jefferson, as president, launches a war in the Mediterranean without congressional authorization. He actually has his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, raise money on the Dutch bond market so he wouldn't have to rely on congressional appropriations and oversight to conduct that war because the Speaker of the House hated Jefferson, even though they were nominally allies. And Jefferson is personally selecting each individual ship captain on that deployment and entrusting them with secret orders. So Jefferson is waging the Barbary War in a way that Hamilton would certainly have approved of, but Jefferson would not. But then comes the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Where does it say in the Constitution that the president can purchase territory and double the size of the Union by his own signature on a piece of paper? It's not there. And many accused Jefferson of behaving like a complete autocrat, like Louis XVI or George III on steroids, by attempting this policy. And a young Virginian wrote to Jefferson later in his life and said in 1810, after he's retired, and argues, I'm an admirer of yours. I've always favored your principles, but yet you violated every single thing you believed in Louisiana. Why did you do this? And to Jefferson's credit, just as he had done on these cases of revolution, Jefferson was honest in acknowledging the hypocrisy. Not only that, he praised the hypocrisy and argued to this young man, you're absolutely right. I absolutely broke with all of my values, and I would do it again tomorrow morning. Why? National security. It was in the interest of the United States. Consider the following. Quote, the question you propose, whether circumstances sometimes occur, which makes it a duty in officers of high trust to assume authorities beyond the law, is easy of solution in principle, but sometimes embarrassing in practice. A strict observance of our written laws is doubtless one of the high duties of a good citizen, but it is not the highest. The law of necessity, of self-preservation, of saving our country when in danger, are of higher obligation. To lose our country by a scrupulous adherence to our written law would be to lose the law itself, with life, liberty, property, and all those who are enjoying them with us, unquote. In other words, what Jefferson argues here is the president has the right to calculate national security the way he sees fit and to implement these policies even though it would occasionally require extra constitutional means. And in this, Jefferson sets a precedent that goes far beyond him. This letter, that doctrine Jefferson lays out, has been broadly construed as the concept of executive privilege, and Richard Nixon's attorneys included this document in their brief before the Supreme Court in 1974, and President Bush's attorneys used it in defending administration anti-terror policies after 2002. So Jefferson's conception here of a president having the right to decide when the national security of the United States would warrant occasionally taking on additional powers is one that resonates in American history, and certainly was of great advantage in the case of Louisiana, where Jefferson argued that the time it would take to even try to get a constitutional amendment would give Napoleon far too much time to recalculate the deal in French interests. But the same logic applied with what I have been discussing on Jefferson's idea of political culture. He is constantly having to hold at bay what today would be called the hawks, the interventionists, those that favored a strong American support for the Republican French government, those who favored a recognition of a free black government in Haiti, those who were favoring recognition of Bolivar's government and his struggle against New Spain. This was, while the political culture was different in the United States at the time, and we didn't have a 24-hour news cycle, that did not mean that Jefferson was not getting attacked constantly among those who favored a stronger, what today would be called American exceptionalist argument, that the United States would have to use its example not only as a beacon, but also as a program of change globally. Jefferson rejects this, and he does it at great peril. He is constantly forced to defend, he's constantly forced to pivot, he's constantly forced to try to make these determinations. But at the end of the day, what Jefferson comes down to is this idea of what I would call a small c conservative approach, not only to American security, but also to the use of American power. That American power and American ideals were designed around what existed in North America in the context of the British colonies. They are not a manifesto for world revolution. And not only is the United States skating on thin ice by becoming too involved in these foreign conflicts, unless, like in North Africa, they directly served American trade interests at that time, or in Haiti, when you could bleed a French occupation army. Other than that, the United States needs to be cautious, because not only might those revolutions fail, as most of them do, but also Jefferson doesn't know that they might involve the United States in a larger war. What if the United States, by backing one side, invites the opprobrium of the other? This is why in 1793 he wants to be neutral. Imagine being Secretary of State and having a French government bringing British ships into American ports in Philadelphia and Charleston in order to be assessed in American prize courts. How do you take a position on that without antagonizing the British, who may then invade the United States from Canada? So these aren't just abstract arguments, they're real. And the reason why I enjoy speaking about Jefferson in this context is that I've been working on him and his diplomacy for the better part of 25 years. And I've hit, just now I flatter myself that I've hit the smallest snowflake on the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding not only Jefferson's own conception of these issues, but their importance in America today. Because I hope, at least, as I was describing some of these specific contexts, you could draw some larger parallels and realize that while not perfect, no historical parallel is. Jefferson's world and dealing with these questions is not as far removed from 2013 as you may think, and that Jefferson and the issues that are facing the United States today did not just come like a genie out of a bottle at the end of World War II or after 9/11. They were around from the birth of the Republic. Isolationism was never a practical policy that was followed by any of the Founding Fathers. And Jefferson, who had been the penman and the spokesman of revolution in America, found himself actually on the conservative side of the debate in every revolutionary struggle that took place later. And to me, I'll submit in closing that the main barometer of that, the guide to that, was what you're studying, and I think the most important thing you can study in trying to understand the basis of foreign policy, and that is political culture and larger social norms. If you don't understand those societies, you cannot possibly make a coherent policy, let alone a national security strategy. And Thomas Jefferson is a pretty good guide, I think, to understanding that process. So with that, I will close and invite questions on all things Jeffersonian. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, Jim, that was really a cornerstone presentation that we should really take to heart as the foundation for this program and for what we should go forth with. Several points that I take out of that is that we should consider cultures as not static but dynamic, that we should learn from, as everybody says, past history, and know that what we have as our society and political structure is not necessarily transportable to somebody else, that it can not easily be taken and replaced or replace another society's form of government, And what my question in all this is, how do we get this very basic understanding of the principles that you've outlined here more widely known, particularly in the State Department or with our government? And how can we give them some idea of, well, look, maybe you ought to consider this before you leap into that, because we've been leaping and getting into, and I'm not so sure that the results are quite satisfactory compared to where we could have been.
Well, first of all, your summary of the takeaway that I was putting with Jefferson in terms of the importance of culture, you stated far more eloquently than I did, and I agree completely with that as being the capsule with this. In terms of implementing it, first let's start with Jefferson. Jefferson read aggressively, and that's where he formed his understanding, was reading. Jefferson is a connoisseur of history. He has the best library in all of North America, and Jefferson informs his own personal understanding of French and Venezuelan and Haitian culture based on his reading. He also bases it on firsthand travel reports. Later in his life, if, for example, I have a very good friend and colleague who's now in residence at Monticello from Spain, who's working on Alexander von Humboldt, who's the great Prussian explorer. Humboldt and Jefferson had a great relationship. Humboldt spent 5 years in South America, and he talked to all these figures. And whenever he came to Washington, Jefferson just picked his brain and just sat down at a table with a piece of paper and let Humboldt speak and wrote everything down. In other words, Jefferson, like a good diplomat, listened to firsthand field reports. He devoured background data in terms of histories of countries. Now, not all of those were accurate, any more than they would be today. Jefferson read some books that were dubious, not that he knew they were dubious, but it was just the scholarship of the time. But the main idea here is the understanding that America itself, I think this is the answer to your question. It's what I call the post-Potsdam fallacy, the belief that the United States was created by God in 1945 and that the world sort of just blossomed to this. If you look at just about every textbook in American foreign policy, just about every course, including those at UVA, they begin in 1945. And if you start an understanding of American foreign policy at the end of the Second World War, you're going to get it wrong. Because actually, that period of the 45 years of the Cold War was the exception rather than a rule of international society. After 9/11, we began to get that a little bit more. And certainly today with the rise of India and China, we're beginning to see the multipolarity. But I think it's really just the mission of education that you're putting forward, that the AAD puts forward. I had an unenviable task. I was asked by Monticello to give a lecture for the State Department for a group of dignitaries from new democracies. And I was asked to give a talk about Jefferson and democracy. And I went, whew, I'm going to be speaking to Egyptians who are asking me, what would Jefferson think about the overthrow of Mubarak? And he wouldn't have thought much of it, I think. And talking about what would be Jefferson's response to some of these revolutions. And I had to tell these people, who were very optimistic about spreading democracy in their society, that if Thomas Jefferson were alive, he'd tell you to cool it. He would tell you, be careful. And what was interesting is when I said that, trying to be diplomatic, not to offend the State Department, I realized how all of them were nodding very aggressively. This is understood. They were the first ones to understand the challenges that were facing democracies in their society. They didn't need to be told this. And so I think really just the role of education for an informed citizenry, it's probably a longer answer than you want, is the way to get about it. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. It was most enlightening. It was fascinating. If I may say, I was surprised to see you're so young. When I heard the introduction, I expected somebody
Thank you. I'm older than I look. So.
That's good.
I thank my grandmother's genes for that.
All right. Obviously, I agree with everything that was just said. I have the feeling that the focus on American foreign policy after 1945 is based partly on the enormous success that they achieved in reconstructing Western Europe. I'm talking about Germany in particular, as you can probably tell. The so-called reintroduction of American values, of American democracy, the re-education of an entire population was an enormous success. I would think, beyond their wildest dreams after the initial end of the war. So it's easy to understand why all of a sudden the State Department and everybody else in the US felt, well, we are it. What we have done there, we can duplicate everywhere else. The fallacy of that we, of course, see in Afghanistan. The question I have is, and I think it's similar to that, how can one achieve a change in the educational system as such, because that to me seems to be the lack in American foreign policy. Not so much that an individual might have the right idea, but that the overall understanding in the nation at large is dismal. I mean, people don't know where Chechnya and Czech Republic are. And I find that frightening after the latest events in Boston.
Well, they can barely find where San Francisco is sometimes in the United States.
Well, yeah, I have been asked if one can drink the water in Germany. So you are in the field of education, and I used to be, but what can one do to approach this particular area?
You can get me going on this because I did a comparative study of Jefferson and Metternich, and I actually taught the standard European diplomatic history class at UVA for almost 10 years. I lecture quite a bit on some aspects of contemporary Europe and Germany and what had gone on in Germany in terms of re-education, the building of that new society. It's important today because Germany is still struggling with that new role. I had just been reading an article in Der Spiegel about this ambivalence and the march on German military power, and that's certainly changing because as Germans get younger and Hitler fades further and further into the rearview mirror, you now have this view that now Germany is a regular country and they have every right to demand from Spain and Greece and Italy certain concessions in regard for German economic exchanges, and Germany shouldn't simply just give things away because it's guilty about the war. And that is something that's an organic process that occurs generationally and occurs also with an appraisal of history. But when I teach at FEI, and a lot of my time now is spent lecturing not to undergraduates as I used to, but to lecturing to folks like you, to lecturing particularly to people in the military, especially at the senior command level, and members of the American Civil Service, which I find very enjoyable because you all have experiences you can draw on, is the importance of teaching history at that level. In France, for example, if you're going to go through the equivalent of the French Foreign Service Academy, there is a mandatory 2-year course in French diplomatic history going back to Richelieu. There is no set requirement in the United States for this. We do not focus on diplomacy. There's been a huge amount that's been focused on this. The American Academy for Diplomacy has been working on this initiative for a while on their website in order to promote the teaching of diplomatic history at colleges and universities, but also in governments. So for that reason, if I'm going to be speaking to a European audience, when I've given talks in Salzburg or Berlin, and you start referencing Frederick the Great, everybody's nodding, and you could go back and talk about the partitions of Poland. When you talk to people in the United States about Ronald Reagan or the Vietnam War, their eyes glaze over because everything is now this arbitrary pre and post. Americans think in pre and post, right? We have a Cold War mindset and a post-Cold War mindset. We have a pre-9/11 mindset. We've got a post-9/11 mindset. There's now the whole September 12th movement, which is, to sort of organize as we were then. This doesn't exist in Europe. I mean, there's a much longer conception of historical time. I love having Europeans come to Monticello. They're walking around going, well, 1769, this is yesterday. There are castles in Germany from the 12th century that are up for sale in the New York Times. So that idea of humility of American power is very important. One, we are a very young country, and I accentuate that all the time. Second, American survival and American independence was made possible by international politics. As a matter of fact, and Americans, their eyes glaze over at this. One of the reasons people say, we play down the fact that we relied on French military power for our independence. If it wasn't for France, there'd still be a Union Jack flying over Philadelphia. Not only that, but one of the reasons why, this is always Americans find this curious, one of the reasons why the French decided to intervene and help us was because the Russians were partitioning Poland, and they wanted to help British help against Russia, so their thinking was, get Britain out of North America, then we and the Brits will make common cause against Catherine the Great. And Americans go, well, that doesn't sound very patriotic. But if it wasn't for Catherine gobbling up Poland, there wouldn't have been French intervention in the American Revolutionary War. And when you get into that, Americans just don't want to take that. So I think the short answer to your question is to try to promote through any forum, this, more formal ones, lectures, symposia, documentaries, anything you can do to get that word out. But you're going to get hit with a lot of resistance, because when I lecture about the American founding, people think that the reason that America succeeded was because all of this happened to be guided ultimately by some providential force. It may be. I'm not here to make a theological argument. But it could be also that the contingencies of power politics matter as much to us as matter to anybody else. It's a core to my being. I wish I could do more with it myself, because I always feel inadequate. The issue is so great. It truly does affect America in the world, how we are perceived, what we do, and yet it's such a daunting challenge to teach. Sir.
Hi. Thanks for highlighting Jefferson's dynamic, if not the plasticity of his values in foreign policy. We're often chew on it of all slavery and domestic stuff. Can I shift you to the Mediterranean, your wheelhouse?
Sure.
Wheelhouse. What motivated Napoleon to want to sell to Jefferson anyway? Was it the British kicking his butt off of Egypt and losing that fleet? So he had it was strictly a matter of money? Or was it coming to grips with how am I going to rule if I keep this foothold in North America? Did Jefferson bend many rules in getting the Louisiana Purchase through?
Absolutely. The main reason, there are several, and you alluded to some. The Egyptian campaign in 1799 was part of it. What really becomes the issue to Napoleon was that the Louisiana Purchase takes place in a period of peace. There are 2 years of, and I say peace with big quotation marks, between 1801 and 1803. This is when the Louisiana Purchase takes place. And it's an armistice. Everybody knows there's going to be another war coming. And Napoleon very strategically looks at the map and realizes that New Orleans is simply beyond his defensive perimeter. If he's going to be facing another war in Europe and potentially involving the Russians and the Austrians coming in the east, then it is simply against his interest to have that many men garrisoning the Mississippi River. And then, of course, the fact that some of his occupation army had been bled down in Haiti, he thought that, to use a common word from the past 10 years, he thought it would be a, quote, cakewalk to suppress the slave uprising in Haiti. And some of the American arms in the Haiti, but especially the climate, malaria, and yellow fever, decimate the French army. So Napoleon is primed to sell. He realizes that the idea of New France, of recreating the French Empire in North America, is a luxury he can't afford. Jefferson knows that. He's getting information that Napoleon is open. He doesn't, by the way, and this is something that's hard to explain, and I don't have a map with me, okay, but think of one. All Jefferson wants is New Orleans. He doesn't care about Nebraska. He doesn't care about Iowa. He doesn't care about all the land he buys. Napoleon throws that in gratis because it doesn't mean worth anything. No offense to anybody from the Midwest. Because it doesn't mean anything without New Orleans. But what he wants is Pensacola and Mobile, because think of the map. If you control New Orleans, you control the Mississippi. If you control the panhandle of Florida and Alabama, you control the sea lanes approaching New Orleans. That's what he wants, and potentially Cuba. And so Napoleon says, all right, I'll do a deal. So Jefferson does two things to facilitate, actually does three. One, he changes his ambassador in Paris. The guy who's there is a guy named Robert Livingston who had been appointed by Adams. Jefferson sends James Monroe because he trusts Monroe. He doesn't trust Livingston. So Jefferson, whenever he wants to ink a deal, he sends somebody he can rely upon. Why did Meriwether Lewis get involved with the Lewis and Clark expedition? It's the same reason why FDR chose Eisenhower, okay, who was a nobody in the American army, because he could trust him politically. And Jefferson takes Lewis because he's from a family down in Ivy that Jefferson knows, and so he sends Monroe to negotiate. That helps him feel comfortable in this process. Second thing he does is he raises money. The money to actually buy Louisiana is raised on a bond issue that Jefferson floats in Europe through a Dutch banking house. So Jefferson is working sort of away from the direct congressional oversight on this, in order to give him some flexibility to have the money. The third, and the most important, is Jefferson knows that a French delegation is going over to France in 1802. Jefferson gives one of his colleagues a letter. This is a letter to give to one of my friends in Europe. But he leaves it unsealed, no wax. So interesting. Is he going to read it? I think so. In which he argues, it's one of Jefferson's most, it's like Bismarck. Jefferson argues there is one spot on the earth that we cannot abide a foreign power occupying. It's New Orleans. If anybody other than us occupies New Orleans, we will go with any other state in the world against that. And he threatens an alliance. This is the short answer to your question. He threatens an alliance with Great Britain. If Napoleon actually lands an army in New Orleans, the United States will enter the war as an ally of England against Napoleon. Now, a lot of people have argued back and forth, and I've weighed in this in conferences. Was he bluffing? Was this poker? Would he really have done it? I think he would have if the stakes were high enough. Nevertheless, it got Napoleon's attention. Because the last thing, even though the United States is a pipsqueak power at the time, the last thing Napoleon needs is American ports closed to his ships that may have to go in and refit. It was a nuisance. So when you add up, it's beyond his defensive perimeter. Jefferson's rattling the saber with the British. His army in Haiti got screwed over. And so he decides, I'm going to ink a deal. And Monroe makes it easy for him. So all of that contributes to the Louisiana Purchase. That's itself a topic of several lectures, but that's the Cliff Notes. Sir?
This has been fascinating, thank you. And you just mentioned a possible alliance that Jefferson was thinking of with the British. And one of the things that I find in listening to your fascinating discussion is I'm drawn to a conclusion that Jefferson had to feel quite ambivalent about Britain. In Britain's culture, which was in many senses a substrate of the American culture as it began to evolve. Here was the nation that allowed that history to prepare us for the revolution, and then, of course, Britain deserved the revolution. But how did he feel personally about the culture of Britain, if you will? How did he feel about the British?
Jefferson draws a distinction between the British government and the British people. Jefferson feels absolutely that he realizes that all of the institutions, particularly the legal institutions that he studies, he is, after all, a practicing attorney, are derived from British experience, and he loves it. He considers the British model of jurisprudence the best in the world. Not only that, but he's advising the French to emulate England. That's his advice to Lafayette in the 1780s. You want a revolution? Become like the British, because he realized that the British moved, and he's got long letters on this. Britain became the democracy it was over time. This was a long organic process that went through many twists and turns. And so he's actually promoting the British model, even as an American ambassador. He has, and in terms of, the king, one of the most interesting meetings, certainly in Jefferson's life, that he, by the way, leaves no record of, is when Jefferson personally met George III in the summer of 1786. Jefferson goes over to meet Adams, who's the American ambassador, and Adams introduces Jefferson, who had written the Declaration, to George III, and they shake hands. And Jefferson and neither one of them leave any record of the meeting. One can only know exactly. Jefferson made a little oblique reference to it. But Jefferson, after that, sees Britain, his concern with Britain is economic. His belief is that the British will still be able to dominate the United States after the Revolution through its commercial power. He's not so much worried about a British physical takeover of the United States, but an economic castration of the United States. And that's what he sees Hamilton as doing. That Hamilton is too cozy. He's too into the speculation in the stock market and the international commercial order of the British. And he has a wonderful letter, I've used this several times, in which he argues that the United States, if we get too cozy to London, the United States will become, quote, a second Portugal, unquote. In other words, the British want a commercial deal with the Americans. They get it in the Jay Treaty of 1795, which is a deal that Hamilton negotiates that gets the United States and the British close commercially. And Jefferson and Hamilton's argument and Jefferson agree on one central idea. People think they're always opposites, but they agree on one thing. The United States is weak and the British can crush us. Hamilton says, if you're weak in international relations, you have to go out and buy a friend. And the British will be our friend. And they will protect us. But if they do, they're going to want something in return, and we're going to have to play by their rules. Jefferson's argument is, okay, that's rational, but if we play by their rules entirely, when will it ever be in their interest to let us become completely independent? Once we fall under their orbit, forget it. We're never going to be independent. So we need to be independent of British trade, because if we're not, we will never achieve what America can achieve. So he wants a divorce, that's his word, by the way, from British commerce, but yet he wants to keep all the institutions of self-governance that he loves. And yeah, it causes him schizophrenia. And he ends his life, interestingly, Lawrence Kaplan wrote an article talking about Jefferson ending his life as an Anglophile. And he titles his essay, "Is this senility or sagacity?" I mean, in the sense of Jefferson sort of ending his life by loving the British because the Monroe Doctrine, which Jefferson approves, is supported by the Royal Navy. Monroe can go out and pontificate all he wants about closing America, but we've got no ability to stop the Spanish or the French from coming in. Only the British do. So the shorthand is, be careful how close you get to the powerful, right? It's the old Indian proverb, don't sleep with the elephant. You know, that's sort of where you wind up with Jefferson and Britain. He doesn't want to break with British society, just British commercial policy.
That is fascinating. Speaking of Jeffersonian schizophrenia, you mentioned but didn't really deal with the big issue of slavery. And I am wondering, I know there were things going on in Britain and in France with the French Revolution, in Britain with the prohibition of trade in slaves earlier, Jefferson's rejection of the institution, and then his tacit acceptance of it de facto. And yet, that's got to be a piece of international relations and policy. And I'd wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, slavery is, while I certainly follow these debates, it's a topic that others are far more sophisticated to deal with than I. Let me answer that by talking about international relations and slavery, which is where I think you're going specifically, because we could be here a lot on this issue. The short answer is yes. Jefferson is forced to realize the hypocrisy of many of his positions, particularly by the French and British. The British have largely outlawed slavery by the late 18th century, and it's already illegal in France. And so when Jefferson goes to France as the American minister and the Hemmings family come, they are technically freed. And John Meacham deals with this in his excellent biography of Jefferson, which I recommend, The Art of Power, in terms of this tacit deal that he makes with Sally Hemings, which is Sally Hemings could have stayed in Paris as a free woman. She comes back to Monticello. And Jefferson works out a loose arrangement, which is, we're going to have a sexual relationship, and you'll come back with me. And in return, I'm going to give you a nice life at Monticello in terms of your duties, and I'm going to free your children when they reach 21. And so Jefferson is hounded by French Republicans saying, hey, look, if you're really as enlightened as you claim, how can you hold people in bondage? And of course, this was put forward famously in Parliament during the American Revolution when, Samuel Johnson's line, why do we hear the largest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? This is in the 1770s. Now, by the way, Jefferson in the Declaration, I talked about slavery. You got to draw an important distinction here. Jefferson was not dealing with the institution of slavery, it was the slave trade. If you read the Declaration, Jefferson attacks the British for promoting the slave trade, not slavery. Now, what's the distinction? Slave trade means importation of slaves from Africa. Jefferson, like most Virginia planters, has a surplus of slaves. He makes money by selling slave labor to the rice plantations in the sugar plantations of the West Indies and the rice plantations in Georgia and South Carolina, where life expectancy is shorter because the climate is more brutal. In other words, by promoting the slave trade, every new slave that comes in from Africa is undercutting the value of Jefferson's property. So he wants to close the slave trade, but keep slavery, because then as a planter, his slaves become worth more money on the market. So it's a lot more careful than this. But yes, Jefferson is dealing internationally with criticism of the American position on slavery. By the way, the same way that President Johnson decides in the 60s to back the Civil Rights Act, partly because of criticism from the Soviet Union, which is that Khrushchev is telling him, hey, if the United States is this great liberal democratic country, why are you treating blacks under separate but equal Jim Crow laws in the American South? American diplomats were hearing that all the time during the Cold War period. And it's one thing that Johnson uses to members of Congress to say, you know, we've got to clean up our act on this because it's really making us look bad. There were other reasons, of course, as well. But international politics played a part in the Civil Rights Act. And Jefferson dealt with it. But yet, the short answer to your question, sir, is that he brushed those off. Jefferson wasn't going to touch slavery. He was not going to deal with it at all because it was not in his interest to do it, and it was not an issue that Jefferson was going to hemorrhage 40 years of political capital that he built on what he considered to be a quixotic campaign. That wasn't going to, I mean, Jefferson would not have been able to outlaw slavery in Albemarle County if he had put all of his weight behind it, let alone Virginia or the nation. And Jefferson lets it go. As a matter of fact, one thing I was talking about yesterday, and it's a subject for another day, is the role that this plays in the founding of the University of Virginia, that Jefferson becomes so nervous about these criticism, not only internationally, but from northern institutions, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, where young Virginians are going to those, that's the only places to go if you're a rich Virginian to get an education, and they're all being taught by Federalists and anti-slavery advocates up there, and coming back to Virginia, and they're, you know, actually criticizing slavery. Ooh, can't have that. And one of the reasons that Jefferson puts into the curriculum of UVA is the Kentucky resolutions and the accentuation of what he considers to be the states' rights principle, of which slavery was part of. So you go back to political culture. Slavery is part of the political culture of the South, and he's not going to jeopardize, he's not getting his hands dirty after building fame and fortune with a campaign against it. But yes, he did deal with it from French and British critics, and including Lafayette, who went to Monticello and looked at Jefferson and said, how can you have these people in bondage when you're a great enlightened man of liberty? And Jefferson sort of said, that's the way it is. I mean, that's unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory to me, but that's what he did. You've got it, sir.
In light of his view that policy is peculiar to its time and place, what do you think Jefferson would think about the originalists on the U.S. Supreme Court?
Not much. Jefferson would, and I've argued with some of them, Jefferson does not like the American Constitution. Madison actually waited to send him the document until it was done because he knew that if he sent him drafts, Jefferson would go crazy, which he does. Jefferson does not like the fact, he argues the president can become, reelected for life, he'll become a dictator. But Jefferson, unlike Patrick Henry, makes his peace with it and accepts it. But then he writes this very interesting argument. In 1789, Jefferson writes that to Madison, this really quirky argument that people have wondered. He had been very sick. He'd been on almost an opiate type of drug, and people think he literally was like on a meth haze when he wrote this essay, that the earth belongs to the living. Jefferson said all constitutions need to be annulled after 19 years. And the reason was that was the length of a generation that he calculated at the time. And so each new generation needs to annul the Constitution and write a new Constitution that reflects the values of that society at that time. Madison writes back and says, you've got to be on Mars. I mean, how would you have contracts and debts and all these things? And even Jefferson later realizes, yeah, okay, that was kind of me being kooky. But, nothing can be further from originalism than to argue that you need to scrap all laws every 19 years and rethink them. Jefferson, like Madison, I believe, I could be completely wrong, would be astonished that we're living under that Constitution today. They would be the first to realize that it would be adaptable. They wrote it to be adaptable. And Jefferson argued, I mean, I'm more with David Souter than Scalia in terms of the interpretation of originalism. And Jefferson would be astounded that this document is actually still the law of the land, not just from jurisprudence, but as I said, the fact that the United States, if Thomas Jefferson can come back and say, wow, no foreign power recolonized the United States after 1783, that would be astonishment. Because they thought the United States was going to become like Poland, where the Prussians and the Austrians and the Russians would be coming in every other Tuesday to be dividing American territory. So I get nervous. There's a great book by Jill Lepore at Harvard. She writes for the New Yorker as well, called The Whites of Their Eyes. It's on the Tea Party and how the Tea Party has used this originalist argument in some of the writings of Jefferson and Madison in a very tortured way. And she doesn't like the Tea Party, and I'm not making a political argument here. I'm notoriously apolitical. But what she's looking at is how, forgetting the Tea Party, it could be the American Socialist Party on the left. How do American social movements misuse the founding period and get it out of context? They take 2013 or 1945, and FDR was as guilty of it as anybody, because FDR invoked Jefferson in order to support the New Deal, which Jefferson would never have supported. So I'm bipartisan in my condemnation of this from the Democrats and the Republicans. I know that's probably an inadequate answer, but I realize we're running low on time.
I want to apply to this presentation, which has been outstanding. One is your comment about the Marines and Tripoli. I just wanted to make sure that everybody realizes the Marines are part of the Department of the Navy, and that it was established by the Continental Congress, I think, in 1771. So we don't want to forget that they're still a part of the
And John
Department of the
Adams in 1822 said that the United States Navy should be considered the child of Thomas Jefferson because of the bar.
We'll accept that. The other is that if you want to continue to learn more about Professor Sofka's dissertations and comments about Jefferson, he's going to be conducting an all-A course next fall. I think it'll start in October.
But it's going to be on the European Union.
Okay, on the
It's
European,
on the European
Union.
But I'm happy to talk Jefferson with anybody until the cows come home. So.
And next week will be our sixth and our final presentation by Majida Bargash, who is going to be talking on Morocco. So thanks again, Jim, and wonderful presentation.
Thanks.